Welcome back. Well, here's our political analysis toolkit again, and you can see that we're up to information power tools. This is the first of two lectures that will examine those tools, asking how do you use them to change people's minds, persuade them. So what do we mean by information power? Let's start with a few examples. Why does a congressman come to favor one policy over another? Why does a regulator come to see one regulatory standard as better than another one? Why does a president see one version of a proposed executive order as superior to several others? And why does a bureaucrat perceive one way of delivering services as better than some other? For political actors, making effective policy choices is critical. Good decisions about bills, regulations, executive orders, and agency procedures, they advance policy goals and build careers. Bad decisions sabotage policy goals and derail careers. Many factors enter into policy choices, but an important one is information. Remember the 4 I's? Sometimes policymakers seek out information. Often it's presented to them by people trying to persuade them. For example, a congressman meets with competing interest groups, listens to testimony in committee, hears from constituents and donors, talks to fellow members and executive branch officials, huddles with his legislative assistant, and is persuaded that one bill is better than another. The regulator consults with substantive experts, meets with affected parties and studies their letters and reports, reads independent studies, reviews public comments, listens to agency legal counsel, reads staff memos, and is persuaded that one standard is better than another. The president attends to competing bureaucratic interests, consults with congressional leaders, reviews option memos, checks with political advisors, and is persuaded that one executive order is better than another. The agency head studies how comparable agencies operate, consults with old hands who've been around the block, meets with agency staff, listens to affected groups, again, is persuaded that one procedure is better than another. This lecture is about information power in policymaking. Here is a definition of information power. The impact of information in changing attention and changing or sustaining policy-relevant beliefs or attention, and hence choices about policy. Here are two quick examples of information power in policymaking. The first concerns information and direct democracy. The second concerns information in legislative policymaking. So the tobacco industry fought doggedly and sometimes unethically to preserve its massive profits in the face of scientific assault, government regulation, public opinion, and private litigation. Ultimately, the tobacco industry lost the tobacco wars. A now almost forgotten skirmish in those wars, fought in California in 1994, illustrates the role of information power in direct democracy. California's progressive era history heavily shapes the state's political institutions. Part of that legacy is the state's frequent use of public initiatives and referenda. Public initiatives allow citizens to bypass the state legislature by directly enacting a piece of legislation placed on the ballot. Although direct democracy through initiatives has some appeal, in practice the cost and difficulty of the initiative process mean that organized interests dominate the process. Only the well-resourced and well-organized can get an initiative on the ballot and wage the public relations campaign necessary for success. And the inability to amend an initiative gives substantial proposal power to the drafters. But these simple facts do not guarantee success for business groups like the insurance industry, the Trial Lawyers Association, and tobacco companies. The story of Proposition 188 illustrates why. Prop 188 was the brainchild of Philip Morris's aggressive political strategy group, especially Vice President for State Activities, Ellen Merlot. As Merlot explained in a memo to Philip Morris's president, finally on or about January 17th, we will file a ballot initiative seeking a state preemption bill that provides for smoker accommodation. The initiative will be filed by 3 independent business and/or association members Simultaneously with our filing of the ballot initiative, we will conduct additional polling to ensure that we thoroughly probe voter reaction to this bill, which preliminary polling indicates we have a very good chance of winning. Now, R.J. Reynolds, the big tobacco company, was less enthusiastic about this idea based on their reading of the polls and the risk of failure. Their preferred strategy focused on the legislature, but Philip Morris pressed on alone. The initiative was titled Ban on Smoking in Public, but in fact, the intent was very far from banning smoking in public. By the early 1990s, many California municipalities had enacted local ordinances banning smoking in restaurants and the workplace. Prop 188, advanced by the tobacco industry, aimed to roll back those ordinances by preempting them at the state level to allow smoking in designated areas in restaurants and workplaces. The proposition would have rolled back 85 local ordinances on smoke-free workplaces and 96 local ordinances for smoke-free restaurants. Reportedly, the tobacco industry spent $18 million to create and advance the initiative. As several scholars explain, Philip Morris began a quiet effort to qualify its initiative using the Dolphin Group, which had created front groups for fighting local ordinances, to run the campaign as Californians for Statewide Smoking Restrictions. Voters began receiving phone calls inquiring whether they would support a uniform state law restricting smoking. Respondents who answered yes received a packet that contained advertising materials and a copy of the petition to be signed and returned. This attractive packet, which cloaked the initiative as a pro-health measure, detailed strict regulations that would be implemented by the proposed law and outlined its benefits. The front group collected over 600,000 signatures supporting the so-called ban on smoking. Polls showed that the public was very confused about the initiative. Many anti-smokers mistakenly believed the initiative banned smoking and therefore supported it. Many smokers had the same mistaken belief and therefore opposed it. The Dolphin Group decided that a stealth campaign was the best way to go. It relied on narrowly targeted direct mail appeals followed by some paid media at the end. Fundamentally, it tried to present the initiative as an anti-smoking measure, but a reasonable one. They confidently expected to outspend the opposition many times over, and did. For example, the anti-Prop 188 coalition persuaded the famous Surgeon General, C. Everett Koop, to cut an anti-Prop 188 ad, but they never had the money to actually run the ad. The situation was quite alarming to Gary Yates, the head of a new health foundation in California, the California Wellness Foundation. Though initially reluctant to get involved in politics, Yates and the foundation decided to mount a truth-oriented counter-campaign. To do so, they entered into a $4 million grant with a nonprofit public relations organization, the Public Media Center, based in San Francisco. The Public Media Center launched a public education campaign with highly visible television, radio, and full-page newspaper ads that carried the banner, "Who supports Prop 188? You have a right to know." Ad copy under the banner merely listed major contributors to both sides. For example, Philip Morris and other tobacco companies for the yes side and major health-oriented groups on the no side. Public media centers' newspaper ads also reprinted both sides' arguments just as they had appeared on the official state ballot pamphlet. Both the California Wellness Foundation and the Public Media Center were careful to adhere strictly to federal regulations. The ads took no position on Prop 188. There was no communication between them and the yes or no campaigns. There was no call to action in the educational materials, and particular segments of voters were not targeted. In short, the campaign merely stated the facts. Further, the Public Media Center went the extra mile by running all ad copy by the state's Fair Political Practices Commission, and the foundation took no part in the campaign after it was funded. The high visibility campaign by the Public Media Center forced the Dolphin Group, the tobacco-funded PR organization, to abandon the stealth campaign. Instead, it began to run a series of copycat ads virtually identical to those of the Public Media Center, but urging support for the initiative. We'll discuss this tactic of signal jamming shortly. A court order stopped the copycat ads. Pro bono work by a DC-based public law group then forced radio stations to identify exactly who was sponsoring the Pro 188 ads. The Just the Facts campaign succeeded brilliantly. Prop 188 went down to defeat with some 6 million no votes against only 2.5 million yes votes, a margin of 71% to 29%. Scholars offer this post-mortem. In 1994, the tobacco industry was nearly successful in tricking California voters into repealing their own tobacco control laws. If the tobacco industry had been able to maintain its original strategy of a stealth campaign, its effort might well have succeeded. By limiting itself to direct mail, the industry would have stayed within a medium where it could control the message and deprive the health community of a platform. However, once the industry was forced out into the more public realm of mainstream advertising, it lost control over the public discourse about Prop 188. Simply publicizing who was really behind the proposition gave the voters the information they wanted and needed. Now, the information supplied by the Public Media Center in its Prop 188 campaign was simple, clear, easy to understand, and reached many voters. We'll return to these points shortly. But direct democracy, with its focus on citizen policymakers, is quite unusual. Information power in legislative policymaking tends to look rather different. Let's look at one example from that forum. Now, one of the most interesting policy developments of the mid-1970s was the deregulation movement in Washington, a movement that continued well into the late 1990s. Beginning with rail and truck transportation, Congress and succeeding administrations deregulated a group of previously regulated industries. Examples include, besides railroads and trucking, airlines, long-distance telecommunications, oil and natural gas, and banking. Now, this policy development is particularly intriguing from the perspective of the interest group matrix, because many of the regulatory agencies in question were clearly captured by the regulated industry, and consumers were rarely organized or even desirous of deregulation. In fact, about the only group that pushed consistently for deregulation were policy economists. So, how did client politics yield deregulation? In fact, a scholarly consensus remains elusive. Many factors were at play. For example, this was the age of stagflation, a poorly performing macroeconomy. Politicians casting about for some response could at least claim that structural changes might lead to lower inflation and higher employment. Important political entrepreneurs, particularly Senator Edward Kennedy, needed new centrist-leaning ideas for a presidential run. In some cases, the entrenched companies were somewhat economically weaker and thus politically less potent and less inclined to fight. Still, in the case of airline deregulation, all the firms but one, United, did fight deregulation, though they eventually bowed to the inevitable. Clearly, though, an important part of the story, at least for airlines, was information. The case for deregulation was highly theoretical. It relied on abstract reasoning, arguing that increased competition would not ruin the industry, but instead lead to a healthy industry with lower fares. Who besides economists could believe such moonbeams? Fortunately for the deregulators, they had some actual evidence. Regulation of the airlines was restricted to interstate commerce, so airlines that operated entirely within a single state escaped the reach of the regulatory agency, the CAB. And in fact, there were two such airlines, Pacific Southwest Airline in California and its imitator in Texas, Southwest Airlines. So there were in fact two deregulated airlines legislators could look at to see what would happen absent the heavy hand of the CAB. In fact, these two airlines were runaway success stories. They charged very low fares, were economically successful, and wildly popular with consumers. They achieved cult status in popular culture. Proponents of deregulation could point to them and say, "See, it really works." The demonstration effect from these two airlines was potent. Of course, it hardly explains deregulation, which was a heavy lift politically. But the demonstration effect and the power of information did play a role.